Hey, everybody, welcome back to Pro AV. Today, I am your host, Ben Thomas. Today, we've got a really fun conversation happening, one that I'm pretty passionate about, and a lot of my experience, especially early on in my AV career, really owe it to this industry specifically, and that's house of worship. The challenge with house of worship, though, is that a lot of people think they really understand the market, and they might not, right? There's a lot of things that happen, whether it's a volunteer-based workflow structure or multi-site workflows or the decision-making process. It looks a whole lot different than it does in most traditional commercial AV verticals. And to break that down today, I've got my buddy Nate Anderson from Ross Video on the show today. Nate, thanks so much for coming on.
Hey, Ben. Yeah, pleasure to be here.
Well, Nate, you and I have similar backgrounds, not only working on staff at churches, but volunteering at churches and faith-based ministries and things like that. So I'd love, especially for our viewers who may not be familiar with you, especially as you're a little bit newer into the hardware manufacturer side, would love to give you a chance to tell your story a little bit about how you got in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, church has been a huge part of my background. Obviously, was really from a technical perspective where I first got into the whole world of AV and production and events. Since then, for about 20 years, have just been in various aspects, both on kind of the user side and also the manufacturer side of the business, and also in events as well. So my passion is really helping to connect folks between the need and the problem that they're facing, and the solution that they might need. So, I've been involved in, like I said, a lot of different areas, both from an event production perspective. I worked with Resi, formerly known as Living as One, which is a large streaming service that is primarily used by churches, and was a part of kind of the whole COVID explosion of streaming, and that time of when every church started realizing, hey, this is more than just a tool for accessibility. This is a requirement, and so have really been able to be a part of the house of worship community through my entire time in those various different areas.
Well, Nate, I appreciate you giving us that context, and it's funny too. And I'll really, before we dig in too deep on the interview, I think it's important to note too that maybe some of those traditionally house of worship and faith-based tools, whether it be Resi or something like ProPresenter, used to kind of be a little bit more siloed, obviously, in the house of worship market, and now are really making significant strides in markets outside that, whether it be broadcast, whether it be event production, things like that. I remember the first time I spec'd ProPresenter into a studio, they laughed at me, and I said, "Okay, find me a tool that's going to do everything you just asked me to do at the price point that you wanted to pay." And oddly enough, we ended up using that. So it's funny because I always love to use that example, because a lot of things start in the house of worship market just out of necessity, right? Whether it's price point, whether it's functionality, flexibility. So I think that's a really fun lens to start our conversation with. But Nate, as we talk about really on a high level house of worship, the decision-making process looks pretty different across size, structure, attendance, things like that. But for this specific question, we'll focus on maybe the mid to larger churches, especially with kind of that background on the Resi side. What are you seeing in terms of decision-making structure in some of those mid to larger churches these days?
Yeah. It's really interesting because there is, I've worked with a lot of different churches, and I've worked with a lot of different decision-making processes. There are some times where the pastor doesn't want to touch AVL at all, and they say, hey, I've got my team that handles that, and that's mostly at the medium to larger churches. You also have some medium to larger churches too, though, where the pastor does have, maybe they're younger, maybe they're more, integrated into technology and kind of the landscape of knowing about the tools. Where you have some very large churches that I've spoken to, and I won't mention any names, but like where you have their senior pastor that's actually very invested into the decision-making process, where they say, hey, does it do this one random obscure thing? And it's very important to them that it does, in order to really be able to present their message as effectively as possible. So it's definitely an ongoing discussion, and one of the questions that we face most often, especially from churches that don't have leadership that's not necessarily quite as invested into the technology ecosystem of their church, is how do we make a case for this? How do we start to go to our leadership team and say, hey, this is the right decision, and this is something that we really need to invest in for us to be able to reach our audience most effectively? And those are sometimes challenging conversations to have. And we've worked with some people over time to be able to really make those discussions as productive as possible.
And one of the things that you see pretty regularly too, not necessarily uniquely, but purchasing decisions at houses of worship are typically made either around or to help support maybe some of their larger events, right? Whether that's an Easter service, a Christmas service, a VBS, or a number of different large events. And those are actually really those are natural inflection points, right? That people tend to want to scale up, try new things, try new technologies. But one of the things I want to touch on that you hit on is that a lot of these mid to large scale churches typically have not necessarily a meteor technology team, but a creative minded team, somebody who's doing the designs, kind of making more of those aesthetic and what I'll call vibey decisions, right? But they're not always the most informed about the technology, which ends up presenting a challenge, right? Because there's a lot of education that you have to do. So talk about, those creative communities specifically, whether they are, the technical side or whether they are kind of that creative and design focused. How do you reach those people, especially when they are the decision makers in the organization?
That's a really interesting question. We, and I'll mention 2 conferences specifically that we have been a part of, or I've been a part of, I should say. But I went when I was a part of Resi. Like, we were involved in both the church IT network community, and we were also involved in the SALT community, right? And as from somebody outside of the church world, would see their roles being very, very similar, of one being the IT side, and SALT is very much more of a creative type of community. Their jobs are very similar in that they work for production in a church, but you're right that the execution is a little bit different sometimes, and that it's one side is, hey, we need to make this work well, and we need to make this technically come off without a hitch. And it might not always be the most flashy. We might, use the most the technology that is going to be the most reliable and the most insured not to fail. From the other side, on the creative side, you might maybe get a little bit more risky, where you say, hey, I want to really pull off something really, really cool. We want to have this, giant kabuki drop, or water curtain or something, and it's like, okay, this comes with an element of technical know-how to be able to really, really, really do it well, but churches often don't have the budget to do it at the scale of some of those creative teams' desires at the same time. So I think the trick is finding the intersection, right? It's saying that we're willing to be scrappy, and we're willing to try new things and be as creative as possible, but at the same time, not letting that come at the risk of it being a total failure, because that represents, worst of all, you can do something entirely creative and really, really cool, and then it fails on you, and it just backfires in your face, and then all of a sudden it just becomes a distraction, which is the main thing that you really want to avoid.
Right. Absolutely. I call it production with a purpose. There's basically all of these ideas, all these technical challenges and things that we can achieve. And, at the end of the day, it has to work, and it has to function, and it has to create value for them. But specifically, you called out a couple of great shows. I'll add a couple more in there. CFX down here in Dallas, which is formerly WFX. And then Philo. Philo's a great show because it does a nice job of merging kind of that creative and that technical side. And then I know, down here in Dallas, Watermark does a lot of really cool stuff with technical pastors and things like that as well. But, there are a lot of great resources, a lot of different organizations that can help kind of give you this information too, especially as you look really in a post-pandemic world, right? One of the things that we saw strike pretty heavily in the pandemic is this idea that most churches, if not 95% of churches, that's probably an overestimation a little bit, but we're forced to pivot to streaming, right? Because of capacity restrictions, opening restrictions, things like that. Talk a bit about that from a pandemic perspective. How are some of the ways that you've seen houses of worship and organizations, faith-based organizations, shift more towards media and more towards the technology in a post-pandemic world?
Ben, I remember the day. It kind of gives me the chills a little bit, because I was sitting at it was a First Watch, which is like a breakfast place around here in Denver, and I was getting some work done with a few members of my team, and we see somebody pop up, in some community about like, hey, this COVID thing, is this gonna impact how we do services? And it kind of got our wheels turning, and we started to think, maybe we should kind of think about this. And I posted a poll within our community, and I was like, all right, who thinks that like virtual services are going to become like something that you're going to be relying on, like live streaming services in the near future because of COVID? Overwhelmingly, I'm talking 85-90% of people were just like, nah, like nothing, nothing's going to impact it. We're going to keep doing the same thing that we've been doing. And then what felt like overnight, things changed, right? And we were all of a sudden a lot busier at Resi, to say the least. But it was a really good opportunity for me, and I think for others, to kind of come together as a community and say, this is a discussion that we should have probably had a while ago, which was, how do we really represent our church in the best way online? And there's a lot there. I'm not going to say that there aren't disadvantages to online only community, especially an online only community. I think, of course, the physical representation of a community is always going to be, the most effective in terms of tangible physical community. And if we use the fellowship word, right? But like, there were some great discussions that we kind of got to have along the way with some of these technical leaders, to be able to say, how do we represent our community in the best way online? How do we make it the most accessible for people who maybe haven't even been able to be in a building because of physical limitations or geographic limitations or social anxiety or some of these different things? How do we start making a church community that at the end of the day is just more accessible, plain and simple?
Yeah, and it's been wonderful to see really how scrappy we became, right? The church notoriously is do as much as possible with as few resources as possible, but it was exciting to see, churches really investing heavily in that online experience because they had to, right?
Mm-hmm.
No longer was it, in some cases, just a single lock-off camera. It became a little bit more organized, right? You start talking about integrating graphics and lower thirds and video playback, right, and really changing how that was done. And obviously we've reverted largely back to in-person gatherings, but it's important to kind of look at how that mark has stayed, right? Whether it's online communities through church, whether it's internet campuses, things
Mm-hmm.
like that. And we start talking about internet campus, that can start meaning a lot of different things to different people. But jumping back, I want to talk about something that is kind of unique to the church community, and that's the volunteer base.
Yeah.
And we would be remiss if we didn't mention it in any conversation about House of Worship, because it's probably, I would say, the number one differentiator between the House of Worship market and most commercial markets. So if you're not aware, which I'm sure most of you guys are at this point, volunteers basically run the church for free, including and all the way up to like A1ing and lighting directing and technical directing. Most of those positions in a lot of churches are volunteer only. And it's typically a new person kind of every week. There's a cadence of maybe sometimes people are serving once a month or once every couple of weeks. So there is a revolving door of people who are touching not only technology, but services, equipment, helping with ideation, things like that. And, Nate, as we talk about volunteers specifically, and I think this is a place where you can really give some positive insight, is, especially from a manufacturer and an integrator perspective, how should we approach these volunteers knowing that they all have to be trained, knowing that there's a kind of this revolving door of volunteers? What are some of the things that manufacturers and integrators specifically could take away from this conversation today?
Wow, that's a really good question. I think acknowledging their existence is really the first step, and realizing that, just like you're saying, I used to have a pastor that used to, when I was on staff at a church, and he would on our volunteer nights, he would kind of reference our staff, and he would say, "Yeah, we pay them to be good. You guys are good for nothing." Talking about the volunteers, and it was just like you really have to like appreciate these people in different ways. And the church obviously appreciates them. The church appreciates them by, or hopefully should be appreciating them by whatever means necessary in order to keep them feeling engaged in that community and keep them feeling valuable. I volunteered at a church here in Red Rocks that does a fantastic job of that. They have teen nights every couple weeks or every couple months, and they have dinners, and they bring in breakfast and really just treat them as the valuable core of the production force that they are, which is what you're saying. And I think integrators could and people kind of on this side could really recognize that there are people that have other day jobs that are such a valuable core part of utilizing their technology. And I've seen that happen in a number of different ways. I've worked with some integrators in the past that have been very good about that, where they say, "Hey, I recognize that there is a community of folks within this area that are a part of other occupations, but are a valuable part of this community, this church community as a whole. And so let's do a barbecue dinner, and we're not going to have it during the day because we know that they're, doing their other jobs, doing accounting or whatever, but we'll do something at night, and we'll bring a really good speaker in to kind of provide some insight into this community, and serve them some really good food. And maybe we'll talk about some products and talk about our solutions and talk about how we can help them." And that's something that's really I'm passionate about kind of at this stage for me too, where I've kind of worked with all sides, and I recognize the value that integrators bring into the situation, into these types of situations. So right now I'm really thinking about a lot of those different ways that we can start to kind of make that happen and build those communities in really effective ways.
Well, and I'll add this too. I for a long time was a Ross user even before my days here at Market Scale, and one of the things that felt very, very intentional about the product design was that whether it was through macros, shot boxes, ease of use on dashboard tools, things like that, there was some intentionality there, right? And that's one of the challenges, especially like on the broadcast technology camera side, where you want to have tools that could scale all the way up, right? Where you're doing incredible productions, but something that has to be operable for an end user, for even, we start talking about some of those smaller O&O markets for broadcasters and news stations, things like that. It has to be able to scale down to that. And that's one of the things that you guys have done a great job of. And, Nate, I'll kind of leave you with this as someone who has their finger on the pulse really of what's happening in House of Worship. In general, what are some of the things that you anticipate seeing in the next 5-10 years from a media perspective, really that are going to continue to inform not only the Ross vision, but really the vision of the House of Worship community as a whole?
Man, yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's continuing to use ways to use leading innovative technology in order to create the most engaging environments that reach and engage and grow audiences. I think, like you're saying, that the cool thing, you referenced ProPresenter and Resi kind of in this bucket of finding really creative ways to be able to do some pretty powerful stuff at a low cost. And I love that. I love that perspective of finding solutions that are accessible to do things really, really well, and leading with that, and finding that intersection, just like we talked about creativity and what's possible with today's technology in an accessible way. I one of the areas, and I talked about this at my time at Resi. There's a webinar that's up on our website too about how Life Church was doing it, but these little VR headsets, right? These Oculus. It's like that to me is like, that's a good example of like, these things were previously inaccessible. You had to have 10 cameras around your room and thousands of dollars worth of equipment. Now Meta's coming out with these, $200-$300 headsets. You can have, one for each of your kids and whatever, and buy them for all of your team, and all of a sudden you can have virtual meetings. I don't know. I'm still trying to kind of figure out how VR and metaverse will play into the church's future. I have a feeling if it grows in culture and becomes more of a mainstay in culture, it will be used somehow creatively within church. And so kind of looking at those things like VR, looking at some of those emerging technologies that say, hey, these are really, really have some great potential in terms of the same things that the churches need to do, which is build community and reach people and share a message and support them. And that is something that I think, looking at technology that does that effectively in new and emerging ways is going to be really, really cool.
Well, Nate, we appreciate you coming on the show today. This is the first, hopefully, of many appearances on the show because, look, the insight that you gave the listeners today is really, really incredible and really valuable, right? Especially as somebody who comes from that world, and, being able to have that perspective is so critical as we look to expand more and more into emerging markets as a commercial AV community. But Nate, thanks so much for hopping on. We'll have you again next time.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ben.
And thank you guys for tuning in. Be sure to watch us during our next episode.